Hello, junkies. This is the correct version of the detective episode number 3. You may have originally heard a 23-second version of this episode, or you may have heard the longer version that actually included the story for episode 4. I blame all of the meth. This, however, is the correct episode number 3 of The Detective. Without further ado, let's go. Welcome to the serialized audiobook, The Detective, written by Scott Sigler and Matt Wallace, narrated by Scott Sigler. Book 2, Grim Tyrant Valley. Chapter 7, Nathaniel Cornish, Sr. He was registered at the McCovey Stadium Inn as Mr. Nathaniel Cornish, Sr. Mr. Cornish was a marginally successful sales representative. For the whole of his career, he'd been employed by Magi Mining Supplies Incorporated, one of the seemingly endless and wholly indistinguishable companies that hawked industrial machinery throughout McCovey and the other Pierce Nation mining colonies. He was a deacon at his church, a family man, polite but forgettable. It was a good cover. Fred enjoyed Nathaniel's accommodations. Considering, however, that Fred had very recently committed a major crime by breaking into the stadium less than 100 yards from his junior suite, he felt it was time to change hotels. The laws on Mining Colony 6 were barbaric by any civilized sentient standards. When you threw in the crew of dangerous-looking aliens he'd bumped up against during the job, and the fact that Ghoulie could finger him, staying a few steps ahead of the game wasn't just smart. It was necessary. Returning to the hotel at all probably wasn't the most prudent move, but Fred needed to pick up his gear. He also didn't like leaving loose ends. A guest disappearing without checking out, especially one who left behind a cache of high-end spy equipment, would raise flags and questions and leave a trail to be followed. Back in his suite, Fred removed the air filtration vent behind which he'd stashed his more sensitive luggage. He believed in two things when it came to the job: traveling light and never being under-equipped. Balancing the two edicts had taken years to perfect. From inside the vent, he removed 2 cases, each small enough to fit in a coat pocket without a bulge. One case contained surveillance equipment, communications tools, and data recovery devices. It was all microtechnology, some of it standard, and other pieces Fred had designed, if not outright built, himself. He was no hardware whiz, but he was a quick study. The other case was Fred's masquerade kit. Among the kit's contents was a compressed tube of dermal reconstructive, an organic compound that adhered to and mimicked flesh. With it, Fred could quickly and expertly create a different nose, make a more bulbous chin, or even alter his cheekbones. He could create scars or other distinguishing features, and a little went a long way. There was also a microfiber bodysuit that folded to the size of a handkerchief. Patches of it would hold rigid shapes and could be molded by electrical current. It allowed Fred to change his body type in any one of 100 ways. Finally, a dye-and-cut kit for his hair, bags of extensions in case he needed a shaggier look, and digital lenses that could make his eyes any color. Fred's military history gave him numerous skills that were vital in his line of work. His best skill, however, a genuine talent for disguise, had come from an entirely different place. As a teenager, he'd participated in church theater. He played saints, apostles, even the parts of women, because women in the Pierce Nation were not allowed to act. Fred had been a decent enough actor for the lead parts, but he'd rarely played them. With a good costume and prosthetics, he could lose himself in a bit role. Fred never liked playing the lead. He loved being a character actor. He'd had chances to move on to professional acting, but he'd never landed a gig. Fact was, he just wasn't good enough. He didn't have the talent to make it on the stage, but making a paying audience believe was far harder than making strangers think you were someone you were not. Audiences watched you, strangers usually didn't. It was funny how some things came full circle. Had he been a better actor, he would have made a living at it. But he wasn't good enough, which led him to the military. A military history led him into gun work led him into the private investigator business, and it was there that his skill of becoming a different person found a home. Fred stowed the cases and retrieved the final items he'd hidden in the vent: his weapons. He preferred stealth on the job. He believed in avoiding conflict whenever possible. He was an investigator now, not a soldier. But his brush with Ghoulie and those Quith warriors during the stadium penetration had changed the rules of this one in a big way. That kind of opposition wouldn't arrest him, they would murder him where he stood. And until Fred knew exactly who they were and what they wanted, he had to accept that as a possibility. And he would have to stay well-heeled for the rest of this job. He never traveled with firearms. They were too easily detected on ship or by port security. If you were caught with a gun, you talked to the Creterakian patrols, something he'd done once, and once was more than enough to ever want to do it again. If he needed a gun, he found one on site. Most of the time, though, he relied on more basic, more primitive methods. His Special Forces service gave him the best training the Purist Nation Army had to offer. They'd schooled him in the blade and the baton, in hands and chokeholds. And whatever PN training might have lacked, Fred had more than supplemented with real-world experience. His choice in weaponry on the job reflected that. They were all custom implements. There was a blade maker back on Ionath, a human of Spanish descent, a master, and one of the few craftsmen of his race from whom the Quith would buy weapons. His was a family trade, and he liked to brag that his lineage went all the way back to master bladesmiths of Toledo, Earth, millennia ago. Fred had saved the Spaniard's life once. It had been completely by accident, but Fred had never revealed that secret. If it made the man happy to make Fred's personal defense tools at no charge, well, making people happy was a virtue. High One said so. And that made it true, right? The Spaniard had built a unique shoulder holster exactly to Fred's specifications. A set of match blades ran up his flanks, the handle of each close to his armpits. The blades were forged from composite materials that would pass 99% of the body scans out there. Fred could reach for either or both, and it would seem like he was simply delving into his inside jacket pockets. He pulled out the shoulder rig and slipped it on with practiced familiarity. Where the straps of the shoulder rig crisscrossed his upper back, another blade was deftly concealed, this one shorter and curved like the talon of some giant predatory bird. It was an ancient earth design known as a karambit, perfect for slashing, hooking, and dragging your opponent down. Fred wholeheartedly believed in the old human adage that preached, "Never bring a knife to a gunfight." He also believed in shredding his enemies before they had a chance to draw said guns. He packed his gear inside his regular travel bags, donned one of Mr. Cornish's blazers, then left the junior suite. Fred checked out of Stadium Inn. He'd also planted a ghost ticket in the database of one of the mid-range commercial transport lines that ran shuttles to and from Macovey. If anyone dug into Nathaniel's whereabouts, they would find an ordinary trail that had him staying a few days in a nice hotel, then leaving Macovey via the same shuttle line on which he'd arrived. Tracking Nathaniel Cornish Sr. from there would be a time-consuming goose chase. Fred downgraded to a prison cell-sized room at a cheap flophouse on the outskirts of the city. He ditched his Mr. Cornish Sr. persona and made up a name at random. No one here was going to ask for papers to back it up. The desk clerk, half in the bag on black market spirits, or chemicals, or both, looked right through Fred when he checked in. Once in the room, Fred finally called up the information gathered by a sniffer program. Quentin's physical information and career stats were there, of course. Fred casually glanced at these, skipping over them except for one eye-popping set of numbers. At 16 years old, Quentin had been 6'9", 365 pounds. Mr. Sam's business must have been good to feed a kid like that. Fred filtered out everything related to football. That left very little. Quentin's work record from the mines showed dozens of disciplinary incidents for fighting. A big kid like that had been a target for people wanting to make a reputation for themselves. No pit fights. Quentin had been smarter than that, it seemed. That didn't surprise Fred. No one seemed to understand just how smart Quentin was, including Quentin himself. Fred focused on criminal records. Quentin's brother, Quincy, had been hanged for theft. The brother had been a couple years older. He possibly had more information if Fred could find a DNA record of the boy. And then, Fred struck paydirt. Because of Quincy's crime, Quentin had to pay the criminal debt. This, quote, legal recourse, end quote, was designed to create wage slaves, people who owed so much they could never work it all off, but they had to work because they owed the money. The paydirt? Fred found a reference to Quincy all right, but it wasn't Quincy Barnes. Quentin's brother's name was Quincy Carbonaro. Well, I'll be, Fred said to himself. They gave you a new name when you were little, so little you don't even remember it. No wonder I can't find anything on your family. That changed everything. Fred had a DNA sample of Quentin taken from one of the quarterback's many bloody bandages left on the practice field. If Fred could access McCovey's Central Records database and cross-reference that DNA against the family name Carbonaro, maybe he could find something. The discovery filled Fred with satisfaction. Straight-up detective work had produced a clue. He stretched his arms above his head, yawned, felt the exhaustion of the day's efforts. Time for sleep. He sliced open the bottom of the room's sole chair. Inside his new hidey hole, he stashed his work gear and his weapons. Once he was settled, Fred found he was bone-tired and his muscles felt raw. The room had a grimy bathing stall. Fred ran the water as hot as it would get, which was scarcely a step above tepid, and stood under the faucet for a long time. It felt good, even if it did little to soothe his body. He toweled off quickly and crashed on the room's stiff cot of a bed. The mattress felt like it was trying to repel him, and the bed's single pillow was like an empty burlap sack, but it wasn't even 3 minutes before Fred was out. Chapter 8. The Mercenary. Upstairs, the sounds of animal pleasure are a muffled, pig-grunting chorus that can't be ignored. Rico sits at the bar in the parlor of the bordello, weary of trying not to hear it, weary of being in this place, weary of the charade. He's weary of his life, the one he's made since leaving the service, since becoming an ex-commando, bumming around the least regulated rocks in the purest nation and beyond. He has sat drinking with one of the working girls long after his fellows have all disappeared with their own escorts. When they were still downstairs huddled together around him, Rico laughed and shouted and catcalled in time with their drunken chorus. He's quiet now. The girl is still talking, maybe trying to seduce him, maybe just prattling on. He stopped listening. Instead, Rico watches her, studies her body, although not in any erotic sense. She has tattoos. Some are church markings that have been blacked out or burnt with hot irons, leaving pigmented scars. Rico guesses the girl did the blacking out herself after someone else, maybe her father, took the iron to the rest. As he looks at her, feeling nothing, he notices one of the tattoos draped over her collarbone is the Loa. It shouldn't be there. When he started talking to her half an hour ago, she didn't have a Loa tattoo. Yet there he is, skull-faced and perpetually tipping his stovepipe hat to all who look on. "This old horror show, eh, Cher?" the Loa says from the girl's wasted flesh. Its ink-stained lips seem to struggle to move her skin to form words. But Rico knows he'd hear those words loud and clear, even if the Loa had no lips at all. Rico would shrug at the creature if he had any control over this image of himself from the past, but he does not. He can only watch through eyes of the shadow that was. "What's the point of coming back to this memory? You loved no one here, and no one loved you. This was just a stopover in your life, so why come back?" It's true. Rico has been with the Red Moon Company for little more than a month, and he already knows his career as a professional soldier won't live out its rookie year. He despises everything about the mercenary life. He loathes the company he's kept, the jobs his outfit has been hired to do, and the places they have to go to do them. There's no honor in this, no real purpose. And there's no trust or fellowship. The drunken laughs and backslaps are always forced. Any one of these men he fights alongside would just as soon shoot him in the back for the right price. Red Moon has been hired by the local magistrate to clean out a jet cycle gang called Pure Steel. The Pure have been muscling in on the magistrate's illicit business, such as the bordello over which the Red Moon mercs have been given free rein. Rico spent that day doing recon on the Pure's clubhouse. The Pure number less than 50. He's confident about wiping the entire gang from the landscape with a 0 body count on the mercenary side. Now that the rest of his fellow mercs, and what a sad phrase that is, that he has fellow mercs, because he takes a paycheck just like they do, he is one of them, have gone. Rico dismisses the girl. Left to his own thoughts, he hunches over the bar and makes a cigarette out of synthetic paper and black market tobacco. The tobacco is cut to the bone with high one knows what. It tastes like manure and smokes like a neck bone. Still, it occupies him. Its chemicals do their job. Rico strikes a match and lights the handmade cigarette. The first drag is like breathing in a rubber fire. It stings his lungs and pains his head. By the fourth drag, the effect dissipates. Rather than extinguish the match, Rico holds it up to the parlor lights. He is staring at the flame burning below the scorched, blackened head of the match when it happens. The force of the explosion extinguishes the flame. It also knocks Rico hard to the floor, as if he went down under the weight of the entire Ionath Kraken's defensive line. Above Rico, the ceiling has transformed into a floating carpet of fire. He curls into a tight, fetal ball as the second-floor debris rains down. Something hot and heavy hits his elbow, his hip. He feels his hair whoosh into flame. He quickly smothers it with his bare hands, losing several ounces of skin in the process. Then his right hand is on fire, soaked in a glove of flame. The skin blackens and chars like a steak dropped onto glowing coals, but he feels no pain. This part, at least, is not real. The imaginary flame glove winks out of existence. Time passes. Rico's ears are ringing, and blood is trickling from them both. He expects the parlor to be consumed by fire, but it's not. There are flaming patches here and there, but most of it has already burned itself out, leaving only blackened, decimated remains. He'll later learn that the fire was just a side effect of the accelerant used in the explosive device. The concussive force of the blast is what did the most damage. Rico staggers to his feet. He is dazed and off balance. He can't hear. The world around him has been silenced, turning it into something like a dream. His vision makes it shimmer. On instinct, Rico draws his pistol and brings it to bear, arms extended and palms pressed firmly together around it just as he was taught to do back in the service. He heads for what's left of the staircase. The Loa is perched gingerly on the banister.
"You don't want to come up here, boy," it warns. "Ain't nothing you can do. It will only stir you up. What is here that you need to see again?"
And, of course, Rico cannot hear the warning. He rushes past the Loa, stepping over smoldering debris, skipping the steps that were knocked out in the blast. There's more of the second floor left than he would have imagined. Many of the walls have been blown apart, but much of the framework remains intact. There's little order to what he sees. Some pieces of furniture look almost untouched, while others lie in tattered, smoking piles. Rico bolts over the charred rubble, stumbling on the unsure footing. His shoulders and arms singe anew as he bumps into charred corners and hanging bits of board. He comes upon Waycross first, half buried by the debris in the hallway. The man's legs have been torn away by the blast, one below the knee and one above it. He might live, Rico thinks. He might get bionic replacements, or even have new flesh grown to replace what he has lost. Then Rico sees the splinters, some as big and as thick as industrial nails, sticking between Waycross's fingers as they clutch his neck. Those big hands are the only thing stemming the flow of arterial blood. Stemming, but not stopping. Waycross's fresh stumps flail. His not-there feet trying to balance him help him stand. His bugged-out eyes are staring at nothing, or already looking into the great beyond. There is nothing that can be done. Rico keeps moving. Next, he finds Bannon, the crew's sharpshooter. Bannon seems largely undamaged, but he has as much life inside of him as a man-shaped doll. The blast hit him in a way to knock it right out of him. He looks surprised. The woman lying next to him seems much the same way, right down to the expression on her face. Finally, Rico rounds a corner and spots Danforth, the leader of Red Moon Company. Once upon a time, Danforth was a Purist Nation commando, just like Rico. Danforth was naked when it happened. His big body is charred black with flakes of deep red. Rico doesn't know what expression Danforth had when he died because Danforth doesn't have a face anymore. Everywhere there are bodies. Red Moon Company is no more. Rico is the only one left. Later, Rico will learn that Pure Steel knew the magistrate's hired guns were frequenting the bordello. 2 Pures planted a homemade explosive in the upstairs rooms and waited for the Red Moon Mercs to retire for the evening with their chosen companions. Rico will briefly consider going after the gang, seeking vengeance, retribution for his comrades. He will realize that idea is something left over, some bit of instinct from his service days that will never fully die out. He will realize the Red Moon Mercs were not his brothers in arms, just his co-workers. He was lucky. He will choose to stay that way. But all of that comes later. Right now, the smell of burnt flesh and scorched wood is the overwhelming sensory input of the moment. Rico still cannot hear. He can't really see. The glimmering cinders on the wall move and shift, reshaping into the form of a snake-like man wearing a top hat.
How much more do you want to see here, Cher?
Rico has to see all of it, just like he saw it when it happened in real life. The Red Moon Mercs, he gets that. Live by the gun, die by the gun. It's the girls that bother him. They are small. They are young. Some younger than any corpse should be. And there's a room, far enough away from the center of the blast to remain intact, but not far enough away to protect its occupants. It's a room several of the working girls used to protect that which they didn't want their clients and their business to sully.
Last chance, boy.
It sits on Rico's shoulder, neither angel nor devil. It whispers in his ear, simply an observer who has been a part of the scene many times before.
Why not turn away this time? You don't need to look. You don't need to look.
Rico's last chance to avoid this scene was long before now. It was years ago, when he had the choice to become something besides this, besides a mercenary. Rico steps inside the room, and the same words echo hauntingly in his sleeping mind that echoed in the actual moment.
High One, help me. This is a nursery.
Chapter 9. Fred. When Fred woke, his pulse was normal. His breathing was calm, regular. Practice makes perfect, it seemed. Some of the dreams had come so often, they were like watching a familiar old movie. No surprises. This time, however, there were a few after-images. That happened sometimes. He blinked them away, his eyelids shuddering between horrific still frames, until the past faded and the present reclaimed dominance, until all he saw was the flophouse room's dingy ceiling. Fred sat up. His skin was damp here and there, but he wasn't sweating, not really. Usually the memories that plagued his dreams were gone as soon as he opened his eyes. Sometimes, however, he couldn't help reminiscing on those events and the ones that followed. Those girls, that nursery, the little kids. He couldn't do anything for them then, and he couldn't do anything now. If he hadn't been part of Red Moon, those same people would still be dead. Fred folded his legs into the lotus position. He rested his hands on his knees. He breathed in slow, let it out slower. There was no Loa in the real world. Here, he was his own guide, and he could control his thoughts. He could make those memories go away. He finished his short meditation, then stood. The memories hadn't gone anywhere. Fred sighed. Some forms of meditation were better than others. He reached under the room's lone chair and retrieved his shoulder rig. The blade of a knife whispered to him as he freed it from its sheath. He liked that sound. Not in any perverse or sadistic way. He liked that he could rely on it and what it meant. He liked the control. In the dark room, Fred settled into a fighting stance. He worked his body through an old knife drill from his days as a raw recruit. He struck at the vulnerable points on an invisible opponent standing in front of him, slashing and puncturing each one in sequence over and over again. Sternum, abdominal aorta, perineum, femoral artery, brachial punch, then pierce the mandible. Stab a man in the heart and loss of consciousness is instantaneous. Death follows in seconds. Stab him above the clavicle, and the blood will spray out so hard it will splash against the ceiling. Fred slashed and skewered his invisible opponent until a thin sheen of sweat covered his body. Now he was breathing hard in the good way of the here and now, not in the bad way of anguish and loss from which he would never be free. When he'd bled an entire imaginary legion dry, he finally stopped. Fred stood perfectly still for a moment, sucking wind and staring at the vague outline of the wall in the darkness. Suddenly, he hurled the blade in his hand at the same wall. It struck with a loud, dull thud, buried several inches deep in the cheap plaster. Fred thought he heard some muffled, sleepy complaint from the occupant of the next room, but he ignored it. He left the knife there. He dropped down to sit on the edge of his bed. He held his skull in his hands. That was episode number 3. So, if you heard incorrect versions of episode number 3, you're asking, what the hell happened? If you did not hear incorrect versions of episode 3, you're like, but FDO, this sounds fabulous, and your voice is mellifluous as always, resonant, sonorous, and wonderful. How can you possibly have thought that you made a mistake? I did. How did I screw it up? Pretty simple. We have the unabridged audiobook broken down into parts for each chapters. I record an intro, I drag in a part, I record an outro, put it all together, clean it up, boom, we're good to go. This time I just grabbed the wrong one for episode number 3 and compile that with the error of the first time I exported, accidentally producing a 23-second episode and uploading that, putting in the feed. And I also introduced episode number 3 as the Reef episode 3. A lot of screw-ups. Got to fix it up. This might be the result of a serious case of deadline pressure. I have multiple deadlines going on at once. I'm working a lot of hours. And frankly, I was just in a rush. I didn't proofread everything, correct everything. And what can you do? Screwed up. But it's fixed now. Remember, if you don't know what I'm talking about, no mistakes happened. These aren't the droids that you're looking for. The FDO is infallible. We got rid of the evidence. You know what I mean? Those old episodes, they're not going to be bothering anybody anymore. They're gone. All right? That is it for this episode. Come back for more later, more correct episodes, and I will talk to you all real soon. You have been listening to The Detective, a Galactic Football League novella. The Detective is also available as an ebook and as a full-length audiobook. If you want the whole story with no waiting, visit scottsigler.com/The Detective for links to Amazon, Audible, and more. Follow Scott on Instagram and Twitter, where he is at Scott Sigler, one word, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Scott Sigler. The Detective audiobook was directed by A.B. Kovacs and engineered by Steve Rickyberg. Copyright 2019, Empty Set Entertainment, all rights reserved. Theme music is from the band Amps and Volts.